Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the IEA. Today, the IEA has published a new discussion paper entitled Liberalising Discrimination Law, Why the Equality Act is Unfit for Purpose, authored by Alex Morton and Daniel Freeman. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel here in the studio, who's one of the paper's authors. Dan is the IEA's managing editor. Dan, can you tell me why you decided to write the paper in the first place?
So, anti-discrimination legislation, which in the UK essentially, at least in England and Wales, essentially means the Equality Act, is a huge area of regulation because it affects literally every employer in the country, every business in the country, and they have to sort of comply with what's set out there. Now, this is significant because anti-discrimination legislation has expanded really quite dramatically in its scope and ambition since it was first introduced in the 1960s. And so the purpose of this paper was basically to chart the history of anti-discrimination legislation in Britain, see how it's sort of grown and how the ideas around it have changed. And also to look at where it could go in the future, because, in the run-up to the election, Labour were making various promises to expand it even further. So we want to sort of look at the ideas behind it and how you might sort of reform it and pare it down to something that's more kind of focused on particular acts of discrimination, rather than this sort of very, very broad and rather at times blunt instrument to try and sort of level group outcomes and things like that.
That's really interesting. And what led you to actually writing the paper today and actually thinking about the fact that equality legislation has developed so much over time? What does it actually look like? And you wrote a bit about the differences between indirect discrimination and direct discrimination and where the legislation has covered that. So what does the paper actually look at in that respect?
So I think when people think of anti-discrimination legislation, essentially what many people on the street will think of it in terms of direct discrimination. So that's where if you sort of say, there is X job, we are only going to hire a woman, or we are only going to hire a white person, or some other kind of characteristic like that. And this was what anti-discrimination legislation focused on in the 1960s. So you have the 1965 Race Relations Act and the 1968 Act, which focus on acts of discrimination against individuals. So not allowing people into a business, for example, because of their racial origin. But then through the in the 1970s, we got the sort of emergence of this idea of indirect discrimination, where this isn't a case of of rules that are being applied to some individuals but not others. It's about rules that apply evenly to everyone, but that in the view of a court may lead to different outcomes between different groups if the company can't justify this. And so we see this to some extent in how equal pay legislation is set up, because often we get this idea that equal pay claims are about sort of two people doing identical jobs, one person being paid less because she is a woman, or occasionally because he is a man. That's generally not what we see now, and it's generally not how the legislation is applied. So for how it is applied is generally in terms of like differences between large groups of people. So we see this, for example, in the next case that was decided last August. So here we have a case of warehouse staff employed by Next being paid more and getting slightly higher bonuses than staff who work in next shops. Now, this wasn't a case of like only men could work in warehouses and only women could work in the shops. About 50% of workhouse workers were women. It's just in the shops, it was 80% women. And so you end up getting this case going to an employment tribunal, takes about 6 years to decide, hugely controversial. And eventually the tribunal finds that even though there is no evidence of any intent to discriminate, Next still fell foul of the law because they determined that a workhouse worker is equal to someone working in a shop, even though Next, like the reason Next were paying workhouse workers more was in order to fill those positions. Like this is how a market economy is supposed to work. Wages are supposed to respond to a huge number of factors that might attract people into that industry or attract people into another area, and this tends to get ignored, at least in how the legislation is currently set up, and this can create really serious distortions in the economy.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially from the way in which we measure pay differentials. So, for example, any company with more than 250 employees is supposed to report on their gender pay gap payments. But all of that is done predominantly just through like an average or a median of all women in the company and all men in the company, rather than looking at, as you said, the various different differentials that impact pay. And that includes, obviously, supply and demand. If there is a higher supply of people that are willing to work in the shop and less people that are willing to work in the warehouse, Next will have to raise the amount of money they pay warehouse workers in order to ensure they can actually fill that. That's how supply and demand works. But also things like level of experience or the qualifications or just how good they are at the job often is supposed to at least impact somebody's pay. But none of that is decided through a particular commissar in government. It's decided by the market and the price mechanism. But in this case, especially with the Next case, and what the Equal Pay Act has allowed to happen is these are, instead of being decided by the price mechanism, it's being decided by courts.
Yeah, and it's not just Next. This has basically bankrupted Birmingham City Council because you've got cases of tribunals deciding that bin men and cleaners in schools are equivalent work, and therefore extra bonuses that were given to bin men are amounted to discrimination, and therefore they have to pay, literally it's coming up to about £700 million in back pay to various workers over the last decade. And this is probably going to affect a lot of other councils across the country that had similar policies that, again, this was nothing to do with saying, okay, if you're a man, you're going to get paid more. It is simply the averages of these different professions, these different roles. One had many more men, one had many more women. And in order to attract people and keep people in one particular role, you had to offer more money. I think this issue sort of gets to the heart of the general problem that increasingly there's a notion that any sort of difference between two different, often quite small identity groups must be evidence of discrimination. That if X group or X sort of subgroup are earning more than another or less than another, that in itself is kind of evidence of discrimination, and therefore you have to have this constant intervention in the economy in order to sort of level any differences in outcome, which is a it's incredibly burdensome on both on both employers, both in the private sector and the public sector, because they have to, constantly be thinking about these things and constantly being, hiring consultants and this sort of thing. But it can also, distort how they organise their labour force in ways that aren't really helpful to anyone. And
ultimately are less efficient than otherwise they would. Yeah. And it potentially could result in less opportunities for those people. So specifically with the Equality Act, so you're saying that all of this is happening, the differences between indirect discrimination and direct discrimination is in the law. Could you just explain what the current Equality Act actually outlines and why it is that this is the case?
Okay, so it's a bit difficult to explain the whole Equality Act because
why are we getting these outcomes?
Basically, the Equality Act is a consolidation of decades of other anti-discrimination legislation and equal pay legislation into just one big document. And the Equality Act is significant for a few reasons. Firstly, you've got this element of, it incorporates equal pay law that this just really applies to men and women in the same way. It's kind of it's kind of the legacy of the 1970 Equal Pay Act. But then you've got other, like, this incorporates all direct and indirect discrimination legislation. It also introduces for the first time, or modifies the notion of positive action, which before the 2010 Equality Act, basically in recruitment and promotion decisions, you could not discriminate. It was fairly straightforward. You could not treat someone more favorably or less favorably on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, age, etc., etc. What the 2010 Act does with positive action is it basically allows a certain degree of discrimination when you can claim that you have two candidates who are equally able to fill a position. You can say, we are going to use positive action to pick X person from X group, which we believe to be underrepresented. So if for example, you're the RAF and you want more women fighter pilots for some reason, you can, if you have two equal candidates, you can be like, oh, we're going to pick the woman over the man, for example. But, well, in the RAF case is actually quite an interesting one, because it can act as basically a cover for engaging in what is probably illegal positive discrimination. So we recently saw a series of leaks from the RAF about basically the head of HR there saying that, okay, we basically need to ignore all applications from men and just focus on the one from women, because in the public sector this is combined with another provision of the 2010 Equality Act, which is the public sector equality duty, which basically requires all public bodies to act to try and encourage good relations between different groups, different identity groups, and also to encourage equality of opportunity. Now, this can be used by public bodies to basically say, okay, we're going to set targets for recruitment of X group or Y group. And then there's a big incentive to also use positive action beyond just picking, like, between two exactly equal candidates to basically picking less good candidates, but in order to sort of hit your targets.
Those are diversity targets. And I suppose at the core of, the heart of this particular issue is actually that results in discrimination, right? I mean, ultimately, you see all of these different schemes that occur that actually are somehow on the right side of the law, whereas the discrimination that you described at the beginning of this interview, the idea that actually there are a couple of candidates and an employer might choose a white person over a black person, that kind of discrimination, it entirely ignores that. I mean, for example, the civil service fast track, they've got an entire scheme just for what they call Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. That is just looking at Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups for a particular scheme and entirely ignoring every other ethnic group, including white people, of course. So how is that kind of thing legal? And on the right side.
Is actually so the provision of training schemes that actually came in with the 1976 Race Relations Act.
Okay.
That was initially what the what positive action meant. It meant that you were allowed to set up a training scheme, but very significantly, you weren't allowed to make. You weren't allowed to make positions conditional on having completed this training scheme. So basically, it meant that positive action couldn't be used in the recruitment process. In the recruitment process, you couldn't discriminate on these sorts of grounds. This was actually initially one of the criticisms from the left, or from sort of progressive legal activists, of Britain's early anti-discrimination legislation. So you get them criticizing the 1968 Act because it basically prevents American-style affirmative action, which was becoming increasingly increasingly popular through the 1970s, but that never fully arrived in Britain, and even with the Equality Act, there's a sort of tendency to kind of push things in that direction, but stop just short of it. So that's partly where you get this sort of idea of positive action, where it can, in theory, it can only be used when there are two identical candidates.
Which in reality,
in practice, doesn't really happen.
Yeah, I guess the RAF example is one in which it was felt that side of the law.
But then also in the public sector, particularly, you can get sort of quite perverse outcomes when it comes to like trying to avoid any indirect discrimination or any sort of disparate impact at all. So a recent example of this is British Transport Police in 2023, I think it was, got rid of annual fitness tests for their police officers, and they justified this on the grounds that a higher proportion of women failed these tests than men. It was still a tiny minority. I think it was about 9% of female officers fail these fitness tests, as opposed to 3% of men. If that's actually in the interests of, well, it's probably not in the interests of the public. It's dubious as to whether it's actually in the interests of like a police officer who is still serving while being like classified as unfit.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a female police officer and you're classified as unfit to be a police officer, well, startups are in danger. It's really interesting. I think that on all of those points, the difference between the indirect and direct discrimination itself is interesting because of how it's been able to spill over in the UK. Obviously, a lot of the cultural significance, I think, comes from the US. And what do you think about some of the biggest criticisms that the left often throw at this kind of conversation specifically? And I mean the sort of progressive left that often talk about historical injustices, historical discrimination, and how that basically means that today we see different outcomes for different quote unquote marginalized groups. What would you say to that? Would you say that this is a fair intervention, or indeed it isn't fair at all?
I don't think it's particularly well equipped to deal with that, and I don't think any law that sort of focuses on basically really huge identity groups can do that very effectively. Because okay, it's perfectly possible that some individuals may end up having worse outcomes, in part because of their background. But yeah, it's really difficult to kind of measure that. So if we take for example, and if we take for example someone who is from say a Nigerian background who went to a British private school, how if we're to go down this route of, okay, we're going to prescribe different acts of discrimination against different subgroups, okay, how do we weigh that person against someone who grew up in a broken home in the northeast of England, for example? Or how do we assess someone from a Bangladeshi background who has a parent who did a PhD, but also who has another parent who was an alcoholic? Like, in each individual case, there are so many sort of complex things that go into who you are currently, that I don't think you can just sort of say, like, right, we are going to discriminate in favor of X, Y, Z group. Especially in Britain, when you look at outcomes, in even just very rough outcomes in terms of like per capita income or university attendance or things like that, they really don't correlate at all, or don't correlate very well onto like different ethnic groups. So you might have British Indians dramatically outperform British white people when it comes to educational achievement, also in terms of income. But British Pakistanis slightly underperform. Now, I think it's difficult to sort of say that, okay, therefore we ought to discriminate against, say, British Indians when it comes to job applications and in favor of British Pakistanis. I think that's just not a very good way to go about recruiting people.
And ultimately, results of those people being those people
defined by particular identity groups.
Yeah, and defined by mutable characteristics they can't control. I mean, I am North African, and I have various different elements of my own identity that makes me who I am today. That doesn't mean that I should be treated any differently to anybody else with a different background. And ultimately, that's a question of fairness, isn't it? It's about treating it, the initial intention behind the Equality Act, or indeed behind the Racial Equality Act of 1970, Race Relations Act, was to prevent direct discrimination. So, in this paper, Dan, you and Alex argue that we should strip back the Equality Act and focus just on direct discrimination. Could you talk me through why you think that that's the solution to these problems?
So, I think basically we come at it from a perspective that is fairly skeptical of how much government is capable of doing, how much government can know in areas that are as complex as this. And I think if it's a question of simply saying, you cannot say X job is only open to X race or X sex, unless, there's a very good reason for that. That is something government probably can effectively enforce. Whereas when you start getting into questions of trying to equalize group outcomes, I think government is never going to be able to effectively do that in a way that isn't incredibly blunt and distortionary. And therefore, we should concentrate on the things that government actually probably can do reasonably effectively. By basically focusing anti-discrimination legislation on acts of explicit discrimination against individuals, that means you continue to treat people as individuals rather than as sort of, large groups that need to be homogenized. I think that would be a sort of reasonable approach.
That's really interesting. And where do you see the future of this debate actually sort of going? I mean, of course, we had the Trump administration and with Trump's inauguration sort of entirely scrapping a lot of the equality, diversity and inclusion schemes that are implemented by the federal government. Where do you see this debate continuing to go? And actually, do you think that there is the possibility that the Equality Act could be stripped back itself, or do you actually think that things might actually get a lot worse?
Yeah, I think it's developments in America are quite interesting because in one sense, American legislation to do in this area and American legal practice when it comes to things like positive discrimination, affirmative action, went way further than it ever has in Britain. So in America, you get sort of universities explicitly discriminating very heavily against groups like Asian Americans, basically to try and reduce the number of people getting in, Asian Americans getting into better universities, to try and even out the group differences. That never has never fully happened in Britain, but we've sort of got halfway there. And now that things are sort of seem to be turning away from that in the US, partly down to the private sector just becoming a lot more skeptical about and becoming a lot more sort of, very recently becoming more in favor of just meritocracy, something that got sort of, kind of treated with derision like 5 to 10 years ago as, that's just, closet racism or whatever. I think you'll probably find a similar trend in Britain, because Britain, at least culturally, tends to sort of follow the US with like a 2 to 3 year time delay. But in terms of where the legislation is, that's quite a different question. I would be surprised if the current government, at least in this term, significantly rose back on where the Equality Act is currently. But perhaps after the next election, if it's part of sort of a greater move towards deregulation against these sorts of attempts by the state to micromanage the economy, like a really obvious place to start with that is some of the legislation when it comes to indirect acts of discrimination and equal pay and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dan, for joining me today, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you enjoyed this discussion and would like to read the full publication, Liberalising Discrimination Law, then check out the IEA website, iea.org.uk.